They only wanted strength, until strength failed them. The hall stretched wider than a football field, a cathedral of polished obsidian and cold violet light humming softly through layered energy panels overhead, each step echoing like a measured heartbeat against the metallic floor as representatives from 1,000 worlds stood in perfect formation, armor gleaming, insignias glowing, every posture sharpened by expectation, every gaze lifted toward the throne that had not yet been occupied, and somewhere at the very edge of that perfect symmetry stood Lucas Grant, 6 feet 2, human, unremarkable, marked by a thin strip of dull gray fabric across his chest that read in simple standard text, "No ineligible," a label no one questioned, a label no one needed to explain, because in a room built for the strongest, the fastest, the most genetically refined beings in the known systems, a human was not a contender, not a rival, not even a consideration, just a necessary inconvenience, a contractor, a cleaner, a witness to something far beyond him, and yet he stood anyway, boots still dusted with the residue of maintenance corridors, hands calloused from work no one saw, eyes steady not with ambition but with habit, the kind of quiet attention that came from fixing things others ignored, the kind that noticed the flicker in the overhead lattice 2 seconds before it stabilized, the slight dip in harmonic frequency that most wouldn't even hear, a subtle irregularity buried beneath the grandeur, and he almost reached for his toolkit. Before catching himself, because this wasn't his place, not today, not here, so he stayed still as the chamber lights dimmed by a fraction, just enough to shift the atmosphere, just enough to silence the last murmurs as a low chime resonated through the structure, deep and resonant, felt more in the chest than heard, signaling the beginning of the selection rite, an ancient process older than Earth's recorded history, older than most of the species present, where power was measured, evaluated, and chosen, where the empress herself would descend from her elevated throne and walk among them, selecting the one deemed worthy to stand at her side. And as the massive doors at the far end of the hall parted with a slow, deliberate hiss, releasing a wash of cool, luminous air, every figure in the chamber lowered their gaze in practiced unison, every figure except one, because Lucas Grant didn't lower his eyes out of defiance or arrogance, but simply because no one had ever taught him that he should, and so he watched as she entered, Empress Lyra Vera. Her presence not announced by sound but by silence, a stillness that spread outward like gravity, her skin carrying a soft blue luminescence that seemed to absorb and reflect the light around her, her steps measured, precise, each one echoing just slightly out of sync with the rhythm of the hall as if the space itself adjusted to her rather than the other way around, her gaze moving across the assembled elite without pause, without recognition, until for a fraction of a second, so brief most would miss it, it shifted, not upward, not toward the strongest, but outward, toward the edge. Toward the place no one else looked, toward him, and Lucas felt it not as pressure, not as fear, but as something unfamiliar, like being seen in a room designed to overlook him, and then it was gone, her attention moving on as if nothing had happened, as if the moment hadn't existed at all, and yet something in the air had changed, something subtle, something no system could measure. And as the rite formally began and the first of the chosen stepped forward to prove their worth, Lucas remained where he was, hands at his sides, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching, the way he always had, because fixing things meant understanding them first, and for the first time since he had stepped into that impossible hall, he had the quiet, unshakable feeling that something here was about to break. The first contender stepped forward with a precision that felt rehearsed, armor locking into place with a soft magnetic hiss as biometric readings projected above him in layered bands of light, strength indices, neural latency, adaptive response curves, numbers climbing higher than anything Lucas had ever seen on a diagnostic panel, and the hall responded with a subtle shift in tone as if the very air approved, yet beneath that polished display Lucas noticed something else, a faint stutter in the resonance field embedded in the floor beneath the contender's boots, a fluctuation so small it barely registered, like a skipped frame in a flawless sequence, and his eyes flicked instinctively to the lattice overhead where a thin filament of energy pulsed a fraction of a second out of sync with the rest, not enough to trigger alarms, not enough for the technicians lining the upper galleries to react, but enough to catch the attention of someone used to systems that failed quietly before they failed completely, and he exhaled slowly, telling himself it was not his concern, not here, not now, as the contender completed his demonstration and stepped back, acknowledged but not chosen, replaced by another and then another, each more refined, more powerful, more perfect in the ways this empire measured worth. Yet the rhythm of the hull began to feel off, not in any obvious way, not something that would cause panic, just a gradual tightening, like a machine running a little too hot for a little too long, and Lucas shifted his weight, the subtle vibration under his boots growing just enough for him to notice, just enough to make him glance again toward the nearest access seam along the wall, a maintenance panel disguised beneath ornamental plating, the kind of detail no one looked at twice, the kind he had spent years learning to read without thinking, and then it happened, not a failure, not even a warning, just a brief dimming of the overhead light, less than a heartbeat, but it rippled through the chamber like a held breath. Conversation stopped that had never fully started, posture tightened, and Lucas felt his jaw set because that was not ceremonial, that was mechanical, and somewhere in the system something was struggling to keep up with the load being demanded of it. And he knew that pattern, knew it the way a mechanic knows the sound of an engine about to stall, and again he told himself to stay where he was, because stepping forward would mean crossing a line that had already been drawn around him, a line labeled non-eligible, a line that said do not interfere. But then one of the contenders closer to the center faltered, not dramatically, not in a way that drew immediate attention, just a slight misalignment in his stance as the energy field around him fluctuated, and Lucas saw the numbers above him spike and then hesitate, like a system recalculating something it should already understand, and that was enough. Because hesitation in a system like this meant instability, and instability spread, always, and before the nearest attendant could react. Lucas was already moving, not fast, not aggressive, just direct, stepping out of his place at the edge and into the structured space of the right, each step drawing a few startled glances but not yet enough to stop him, his focus locked not on the contender but on the panel he had marked seconds earlier, fingers already tracing the seam as he knelt, ignoring the shift in attention, ignoring the weight of eyes that did not yet understand what he was doing, because to him it was simple. Something was out of alignment, something needed correction, and waiting for permission would only make it worse, and as the panel released with a soft click beneath his touch, exposing the faint glow of circuitry beneath, Lucas Grant did not look up, did not speak, he just reached in, steady, deliberate, as if the entire empire was not watching him cross a boundary he had been told did not exist. The circuitry hummed under his fingertips, not loud, not dramatic, just a strained vibration that did not belong in a system built for perfection, and Lucas narrowed his focus, tuning out the growing tension in the hall as layered lines of alien engineering revealed themselves in shifting hues of blue and gold, patterns that were not human in design but familiar in behavior, because every system, no matter how advanced, followed the same quiet truth: if it could break, it eventually would, and this one was already halfway there, a cascade loop forming deep in the harmonic stabilizer where two feedback signals overlapped just enough to confuse the regulator, not a failure yet, but a question the system could not answer fast enough, and that hesitation was spreading outward, feeding into the right's core field where every contender stood connected to the same energy lattice, meaning one flaw could ripple through all of them, and Lucas exhaled once, steady, grounding himself the way he always did before touching something fragile, because this was not about fixing everything, it was about stopping it from getting worse, and his fingers moved with quiet certainty, bypassing a sealed conduit by rerouting a micro-channel through an exposed junction, not elegant, not permanent, but enough to isolate the feedback loop and give the system room to breathe, and for a moment nothing happened, the hum remained, the tension held, the hull still watching, still waiting, and then the vibration shifted, just slightly, smoothing out like a breath finally released, the overhead lattice realigning in perfect synchronization as the faint flicker disappeared, and the contender at the center straightened without knowing why, his metrics stabilizing as if the universe itself had decided to cooperate again, and only then did Lucas pull his hand back, not triumphant, not even relieved, just finished, because to him this was not a miracle, it was routine, something that needed doing, and he sealed the panel with a soft press, the metal clicking back into place as if it had never been opened at all, and for a second he remained kneeling there, aware now of the silence behind him. Not the respectful silence of ceremony, but something sharper, something uncertain, and slowly, deliberately, he stood, brushing his hands once against his pants out of habit, not looking toward the center, not seeking approval, because that had never been part of his job, and as he turned to step back toward the edge where he belonged, a voice cut through the chamber, not loud, not raised, but absolute in a way that did not require volume, and every movement in the hall stopped instantly, even his. Because some commands were not given through sound alone, they were felt, carried in the structure of the space itself, and Lucas froze mid-step, not out of fear, but because something in that voice told him this moment was no longer his to control, and when he finally lifted his gaze, it was not toward the guards or the officials who had begun to shift uneasily, it was toward her, because Empress Lyra Vera was no longer looking past him, no longer scanning the crowd, her attention fixed entirely on the place he stood, her luminous eyes steady, unreadable, and for the first time since the rite began, the entire empire was not watching the strongest in the room, they were watching the one who had stepped where he was not supposed to, and had not stepped back. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have something to say, but because no one was certain they were allowed to, the silence stretching across the hall like a held breath that refused to release as Lucas remained where he stood, aware now of every detail he had ignored seconds ago, the faint warmth still lingering in the circuitry he had just touched, the distant hum now perfectly balanced, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against him from every direction, yet none of it felt as immediate as the single presence in front of him, because Empress Lyra Vera had not moved, not even a fraction, and still the space between them felt shorter than it should have been, as if distance itself had become irrelevant, and somewhere along the perimeter a figure finally shifted, a member of the High Council stepping forward with controlled urgency, robes flowing in precise symmetry, voice measured but edged with something that was not quite calm, "Your Majesty, the rite has been compromised," the words echoing just enough to break the stillness without shattering it, and others followed, their voices layered but restrained, careful not to rise above protocol. "The human has interfered, the sequence must be reset, regulation requires removal," each statement more formal than the last, each one trying to restore order through language alone, and Lucas listened without reacting, not because he agreed, but because none of it was new to him, labels, boundaries, rules. That explained where he stood and why. He had lived inside those lines long enough to recognize them without needing to hear them spoken, and yet something about the moment felt different, not because of what they were saying, but because of what she was not saying, because Lyra Vera had not acknowledged any of it, her attention still resting on him with that same steady, unreadable focus, and it was that silence, more than any command, that unsettled the chamber, because power usually declared itself, it corrected, it enforced, it responded, but this was something else, something that waited, and Lucas found himself holding that gaze without intending to, not challenging, not submitting, just present in a way he had never needed to justify before, and for a brief second the noise around them seemed to fade, not gone, just distant, like a system running in the background while something more important took priority, and then she moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a single step forward, the soft contact of her foot against the polished floor echoing farther than it should have, carrying through the chamber like a signal no one could ignore. And the effect was immediate, every voice stopped, every motion stilled. The council falling silent mid-argument as if the conversation itself had been disconnected, and Lucas felt something shift again, not in the room, but in the meaning of it, because that step was not part of the rite, it was not part of any documented sequence he had overheard in passing briefings or maintenance chatter, it was unscripted, deliberate, and entirely hers, and still she did not speak, not yet. Instead she closed the distance one measured step at a time, the luminous patterns along her skin catching the ambient light in slow, shifting gradients, her presence growing not louder but clearer, like a signal coming into perfect focus, until she stood just a few feet from him, close enough that the faint energy around her felt like a gentle pressure against his skin, and only then did her voice enter the space again, quiet, even, carrying none of the urgency the others had tried to impose. "You understood the failure," she said, not as a question, not as an accusation, simply as a statement that did not need confirmation, and Lucas hesitated for the first time, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was not sure what kind of response belonged here, in a hall where everything was measured and judged, and after a brief moment he did the only thing that felt honest. "It was not supposed to happen," he said, voice steady, not loud, not defensive, just factual, and for a heartbeat nothing followed, no correction, no reprimand, no dismissal, just that same quiet space between them, and then something changed in her expression, not a smile, not warmth, just the smallest shift, like a variable adjusting inside a system that had just received new data, and across the hall, for the first time, uncertainty replaced certainty, because the right had rules, the empire had structure, but this was something none of them had prepared for. The words settled into the space between them without resistance, not challenged, not dismissed, just accepted in a way that felt unfamiliar to everyone listening, because nothing about this exchange followed the structure they understood, and Lucas could feel it in the stillness that followed, the kind of silence that did not come from obedience but from uncertainty, as if the entire hall was waiting for something that had not been defined yet, and for the first time since he had stepped into the right. He became aware of the exact distance between them, less than 3 feet, close enough to see the subtle variations in the light across her skin, the way it shifted with each measured breath, not decorative, not ornamental, but functional, like a living interface responding to something deeper beneath the surface, and he realized then that whatever she was observing, it was not just what he had done, it was how he had done it, the lack of hesitation, the absence of performance, the simple fact that he had acted without asking whether he was allowed to, and that thought lingered just long enough for him to understand the risk of it, not physical, not immediate, but structural, because systems like this did not respond well to things they could not categorize, and across the chamber the High Council was already recalibrating, their silence breaking again, more carefully this time, more controlled, as if they had recognized that speaking too quickly might push the moment in a direction they could not recover from. Your Majesty, one of them began, voice lowered, deliberate. The human's intervention, while effective, was unauthorized. The right exists to evaluate strength within defined parameters. A pause, chosen with precision, deviation introduces instability, and others nodded in subtle agreement, not challenging her, not directly, but reinforcing the structure they represented. And Lucas almost stepped back then, not because he agreed, but because that was where he belonged. Outside the parameters, outside the equation, but before the movement could complete, her voice interrupted again, not louder, not sharper, just present in a way that overrode everything else. Define strength, she said, and the question did not land like a challenge, it landed like a request for clarity that no one had prepared to answer, and for a second no one spoke, not because they lacked knowledge, but because the definition they relied on had never been questioned in this way, and the same council member responded, slower now, choosing each word as if placing it into a system that might reject it. Strength is capacity, endurance, dominance over environment and opposition. The answer sounded complete, it always had, but now it seemed narrow, and Lyra Vera did not react immediately, her gaze shifting briefly, not away, but through Lucas, as if mapping the interaction against something only she could see, and when she spoke again, her tone remained unchanged. And when the system fails, she said, which of those preserves it? The question did not accuse, it revealed, and Lucas felt it before he fully processed it, the quiet recognition that what he had done did not fit into their categories because it was never meant to compete, it was meant to sustain, and that difference hung in the air, undeniable, unmeasured, and across the chamber the reactions were subtle but real, a shift in posture, a flicker of recalculation in expressions that had been certain minutes ago, and Lucas stood in the middle of it without moving, without claiming anything, because none of this belonged to him. He had not stepped forward to prove something, he had stepped forward because something needed fixing, and that was all. And for the first time since the rite began, the focus of the Empire was no longer on who could win, but on something far less visible, something far more dangerous to their understanding, the possibility that strength had never been what they thought it was. The question did not fade, it settled, embedding itself into the structure of the moment like a new variable the system could not ignore, and Lucas could almost feel the shift ripple outward, not through sound or motion, but through attention, because every mind in that chamber was now recalculating something they had never needed to define before, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was active, searching, adjusting, trying to reconcile a truth that did not fit into the equations they had trusted for generations. And across from him Lyra Vera remained still, her presence unchanged, yet everything around her felt different now, as if the space itself had begun to align with her perspective rather than resist it, and for a moment Lucas forgot where he was supposed to stand, not physically, but in meaning, because the line that had separated him from the rest of the room had not been erased. It had simply become irrelevant, and that realization carried a weight he had not expected, not pride, not fear, something quieter, something closer to responsibility, and before he could settle into that thought another voice entered the space, sharper this time, less patient, a senior counselor stepping forward with a precision that bordered on urgency. Your Majesty, the rite cannot proceed under altered interpretation, its purpose is selection through established criteria. Deviation risks systemic confusion. The words were controlled but the intent was clear. Restore the order, reinforce the boundaries, return the moment to something they could manage, and Lucas almost nodded without thinking, because that was how systems survived, by rejecting what they could not categorize, by returning to known states. But Lyra did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting once more, not away from him but across him, as if placing him within a larger context that extended beyond the hall, beyond the rite itself. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity as before. Then the criteria is incomplete, she said, and the statement did not challenge the system, it exposed its limitation, and that difference mattered, because a system could defend itself against opposition, but it struggled against correction, and Lucas felt that distinction settle into him as well, the quiet understanding that what he had done was not an exception. It was an example of something they had failed to measure, and the council hesitated, not in disagreement, but in uncertainty, because adapting meant admitting that something had been missed, and that was a risk no structured hierarchy took lightly, and in that hesitation the hall seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the next movement, the next decision that would define what this moment became. And Lucas realized then that the rite had already changed, not in ceremony, not in protocol, but in purpose, because whatever happened next would not just select a representative, it would redefine what selection meant, and that was not a small shift, it was a foundational one, the kind that did not announce itself with noise but with consequence, and he stood there, a human marked as non-eligible, aware that he was now part of that shift whether he intended to be or not, and for the first time he felt the urge to step back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, because being seen at this level came with expectations he had never trained for, never asked for, and yet his feet did not move, not because he chose to stay, but because something in the moment held him there, something larger than protocol, larger than hierarchy, something that recognized action over position, and as the silence stretched one more second beyond comfort, Lyra Vera took another step forward, closing the last distance that remained, and this time the shift was undeniable, because she was no longer observing him as part of the rite, she was engaging him as part of the answer, and the entire empire watched without understanding that the question had already been decided, they just had not heard it yet. The distance between them disappeared without announcement, not measured in steps but in attention, and Lucas became aware of the smallest details he would have ignored anywhere else, the faint shift in air pressure as she stopped in front of him, the soft, steady rhythm of the hall's energy field now perfectly aligned around her presence, the way every sound beyond this moment seemed to dim without actually fading, as if the entire chamber had narrowed its focus to a single point, and for the first time he felt something close to hesitation, not because he doubted what he had done, but because he understood now that what came next would not be about fixing anything, it would be about being seen for it, and that was something he had never needed to prepare for. And across the chamber the council remained silent, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in suspension, waiting for a decision that would either restore their world or reshape it, and Lyra Vera did not look away, her gaze steady, not searching anymore, not evaluating, as if whatever question she had been asking had already resolved itself, and when she spoke again, her voice carried no trace of ceremony, no formality designed for the crowd, just clarity. You did not act to be chosen, she said, and Lucas answered before thinking, because the truth did not require preparation, no, his voice even, grounded. And for a fraction of a second something in her expression shifted again, not visible enough to name, but real enough to feel, and then she asked, why, and the question was simple, direct, stripped of everything else, and Lucas took a breath, not deep, just enough to anchor the answer in something honest, because it was failing, he said, a slight pause, then, and no one else moved, and the words settled into the space between them without weight, without performance, just fact, and that was what changed everything, not the action, not the correction, but the reason behind it, because in a hall built on proving worth, he had not tried to prove anything at all, and Lyra Vera held that answer for a moment, not questioning it, not dissecting it, just allowing it to exist as it was, and then, without warning, she turned slightly, not away from him but toward the chamber, toward the thousands who had gathered under a single expectation that no longer fit, and when she spoke this time her voice carried beyond them, filling the hall without rising. "You seek strength," she said, and no one moved, no one responded, because they all understood that this was no longer a question. "You measure it," she continued, "you rank it, compare it, elevate it," a pause, not for effect, but for truth, and yet when your system faltered, none of your measures preserved it. The words did not accuse, they revealed, and across the chamber the impact was immediate, not in noise, but in the way certainty began to fracture, just slightly, just enough to let something else in, and Lucas stood where he was, not part of the address, not separate from it either, because whether he wanted it or not, he had become the example they could not ignore, and Lyra's gaze returned to him then, not as a ruler addressing a subject, but as something far more deliberate, and slowly, with a precision that carried more weight than any command, she raised her hand, not in authority, not in command, but in choice, and placed it lightly against his, the contact brief, controlled, yet unmistakable, and in that moment the entire hall understood what had already happened before a single word confirmed it. Because this was not part of the rite, this was not defined by protocol, this was something else entirely, something that could not be measured or predicted, and Lucas felt it not as power, not as elevation, but as recognition, simple and absolute, and when she finally spoke the words that followed, they did not echo, they settled, permanent, unchallenged. "I choose the one who stayed," and no one in that chamber, not the council, not the contenders, not even Lucas himself, could deny that the meaning of strength had just been rewritten without force, without argument, without anything except a single, undeniable truth. The words did not echo because nothing followed them, not immediately, not in the way the Empire expected. There was no applause, no declaration, no surge of approval or protest, only silence, deep and absolute, the kind that settled into the bones of the structure itself as if even the walls were recalibrating to what had just been said, and Lucas felt her hand withdraw with the same quiet precision it had arrived, leaving behind not warmth but awareness, a shift in position that could not be reversed simply by stepping back, and across the chamber the first reactions began to surface. Subtle at first, a slight turn of a head, a narrowing of eyes, a recalculation happening in real time as those who had spent lifetimes understanding power tried to understand what they had just witnessed, because nothing in their system accounted for this, nothing in their hierarchy explained how a non-eligible human could stand at the center of the rite and be chosen without contest, without trial, without even participating in the measure of strength they had built everything upon. And the High Council did not remain silent forever, one of them stepping forward again, more carefully this time, voice lower, measured with deliberate control. "Your Majesty, such a selection carries implications beyond ceremony," the words chosen to avoid direct opposition while still pressing the weight of consequence. "The rite establishes order across systems, deviation may introduce uncertainty in governance." It was not a rejection, not openly, but it was resistance. Structured and precise, the kind that tried to preserve stability by redefining the moment into something manageable, and Lyra Vera listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her presence unshaken, as if the concern had already been accounted for long before it was spoken, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, unforced. "Uncertainty exists when truth is ignored," she said, and the simplicity of it left no space for argument, because it did not attack their structure, it clarified it. And Lucas stood there, aware that he had become part of a conversation far larger than himself, not as a participant, not as a strategist, but as a point of reference, something real that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted without unraveling what had just been established, and for a brief moment he considered speaking, not to defend himself, not to accept anything, but simply to explain that he had not intended any of this, that he had only seen something broken and acted, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because intention no longer mattered in the way it used to. The moment had already moved beyond it. And across the chamber the contenders who had stood as candidates began to lower their stances, not in defeat, not in humiliation, but in recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the metric they had trained for had shifted beneath their feet, and that no display of strength could answer what had just been asked of them, and the hall itself seemed to respond, the energy lattice overhead adjusting its intensity, not dimming, not brightening, but stabilizing in a way that felt deliberate, as if the system had accepted the correction not just in its circuitry but in its purpose. And Lucas glanced upward for a fraction of a second, noting the perfect synchronization, the absence of strain, the quiet efficiency of something finally aligned, and when he looked back, Lyra was no longer observing him alone, she was addressing the entire chamber again, not as a ruler enforcing decision, but as one revealing it. The right was never meant to reward power, she said, each word measured, undeniable, it was meant to reveal it, a pause, allowing the distinction to settle. And power that preserves will always outlast power that competes. The statement did not rise, it settled, final in a way that required no reinforcement, and in that moment the resistance that had formed around the edges of the chamber did not vanish, but it shifted, no longer pushing against her decision, but adjusting to it, because systems do not collapse when they are corrected, they evolve, and Lucas stood at the center of that evolution without moving, without claiming anything, aware only that the line that had once defined him had disappeared entirely, not erased, but rendered meaningless by something far more difficult to ignore, and for the first time since he had entered the hall, no one was looking at him as something outside the system, they were looking at him as the reason it had just changed. No one moved to end the right, because no one knew how to end something that no longer followed its own rules, and the hall remained suspended in that quiet, shifting awareness where everything still existed but nothing meant quite the same as it had before, and Lucas stood where he was, not at the edge anymore, not entirely at the center either, but somewhere in between, in a place that had not existed until this moment. And he became aware of the way the air felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, as if something invisible had been removed from it, something that had always been there but had never been questioned, and for a second he almost smiled, not because he understood everything, but because he understood one thing clearly, the system had not broken, it had corrected, and that was enough, and beside him Lyra Vera remained still, her presence no longer a point of tension but something steadier, something that no longer needed to assert itself because it had already been accepted, not by force, not by decree, but by the simple fact that no one could argue with what they had witnessed, and across the chamber the council had stepped back, not in retreat, but in adjustment, their roles unchanged but their certainty altered, their silence now something different, something closer to contemplation than control, and the contenders who had come to prove themselves stood in quiet reflection, their strength no longer measured against each other but against something less visible, something harder to display, and Lucas felt their attention shift, not as judgment, not as dismissal, but as recognition, subtle and unspoken, and for the first time he understood what it meant to be seen without needing to explain himself, and that realization settled deeper than anything that had happened so far, because it was not about being chosen, it was about being understood, and slowly, without announcement, the energy lattice above dimmed just slightly, not signaling an end, but a transition, the right moving from something ceremonial into something remembered, something that would be spoken about long after this moment passed, and Lucas exhaled, a quiet, steady breath, grounding himself again in something simple, because despite everything, despite the attention, the shift, the weight of what had just happened, he was still the same person who had noticed a problem and fixed it, and that had not changed, and maybe that was the point, and Lyra turned her gaze once more toward the vast chamber, not to command, not to reinforce, but to acknowledge. And in that acknowledgement there was something new, not just authority, but understanding, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried softer than before, not weaker, just more certain. Let it be recorded, she said, and the words did not echo, they settled. Strength is not what stands above others, a brief pause, not for effect, but for truth, it is what remains when others step away, and no one challenged it, no one needed to, because the proof was still standing there, not elevated, not transformed, just present, and Lucas did not bow, did not speak, did not move to claim anything that had been given, because some things were not meant to be held, they were meant to be lived, and as the hall slowly began to breathe again, quiet motion returning in measured steps, conversations beginning in low tones that carried more thought than certainty, he remained still for one last second, just long enough to understand that nothing about this moment would follow him in the way people expected. Not as power, not as status, but as something quieter. Something harder to lose, and as he finally stepped forward, not toward the throne, not toward the center, but simply forward, into whatever came next, the space did not resist him, did not define him, it simply allowed him to move, and in that simple permission, there was a kind of freedom no system could measure, because he had not become more than human, he had only shown what being human had always meant, and that, in the end, had been enough.